Her train arrived in a blizzard. The cowboy was waiting and said, "I wouldn't miss you." The wind arrived before the train did. It screamed across the Texas plains like a living thing, dragging ice and snow across the tracks, rattling the wooden station walls, and burying the small frontier depot beneath a white, unforgiving shroud. Lanterns swayed violently, their flames flickering as though they too feared being extinguished by the storm. Most men had gone home hours earlier. But Zachary Foster remained. He stood at the edge of the platform, boots planted firmly in the snow that had already reached his ankles, collar turned up against the biting cold. His gloved hands were stiff around the handle of his lantern, knuckles numb, beard dusted white. Each breath burned his lungs, but he did not move. He had promised. Weeks earlier, sitting alone at his rough pine table, Zachary had written a letter by lamplight, hands shaking not from cold but from the weight of hope. He had written honestly, about the ranch, the loneliness, the faith that steadied him when nothing else did. And before sealing the envelope, he had bowed his head and prayed, "Lord, if this woman comes, help me be there when she arrives." Now the sky answered with fury, testing whether a promise made in prayer would still stand when comfort was stripped away. The distant whistle cut through the storm like a blade. Zachary's heart slammed against his ribs. The iron beast emerged slowly from the white void, its headlamp barely visible as it ground its way to the platform. Steam hissed violently, mixing with snow and darkness, and the train lurched to a halt with a groan that echoed across the frozen plain. Doors flew open. Passengers poured out, clutching coats and parcels, faces pinched with fear and impatience. Some cursed the weather. Others laughed nervously as they hurried inside the station. And then she appeared. Amelia Kane stepped down carefully from the train, her boots sinking into the snow as soon as they touched the platform. She wore a wool coat too thin for the storm, a scarf pulled tight around her neck, and clutched a single valise in one hand. In the other hand she held a Bible. Her dark hair had escaped its pins, whipped by the wind across her face. Snow settled on her lashes, melting into tears she had not realized were forming. This was not Philadelphia. This was not the world she had known. The moment her feet touched the platform, fear rose in her chest like the storm itself. She scanned the platform wildly, faces rushed past her, strangers with no reason to stop, no reason to care. What if he isn't here? She thought. She had left everything behind. Her teaching post. Her church. Her sister's tearful goodbye. She had answered a letter written by a man she had never seen, trusting not his face, but his faith. The wind shoved her sideways and she staggered. Then she saw him. At the far end of the platform stood a lone figure, unmoving against the storm. His lantern burned steadily, casting a circle of light in the swirling snow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his coat worn but well-kept, his posture resolute. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't looking for shelter. He was waiting. Zachary's breath caught the moment he saw her step down from the train. He knew her instantly. Not because of her face, but because she stood still in the chaos, clutching a Bible like a lifeline. Because she looked overwhelmed and yet present. Because something in his spirit whispered, "That's her." He took one step forward, then another, boots crunching through the snow. Amelia turned at the sound and froze when she saw him approaching. For a heartbeat neither spoke. Snow fell between them like a curtain. Zachary removed his hat, despite the cold, his voice low but steady when he finally spoke. "Miss Amelia Kane?" Her throat tightened. "Yes." Relief flooded his chest so fast it nearly knocked the breath from him. He nodded once, reverently, as if acknowledging a prayer answered. "I'm Zachary Foster," he said. Then, softer, with something fierce and gentle woven together, he added, "I wouldn't miss you." Something broke open inside Amelia. The fear, the doubt, the long miles of uncertainty, all of it cracked as warmth spread through her chest. Not because he was handsome. Not because he was strong. But because he had come. Because he had stood in a blizzard to keep a promise. Tears streamed freely now, freezing against her cheeks as she smiled. "I wasn't sure anyone would still be here in weather like this." Zachary lifted the lantern slightly, shielding its flame. "I told the Lord I'd be right here when you arrived. Figured I'd best keep my word." The station bell clanged behind them. The train hissed, impatient to leave. Zachary offered his arm, hesitant but respectful. "Let's get you out of this storm," he said. "The wagon's close. We'll talk where the wind can't steal our words." Amelia placed her hand on his arm, her grip tentative, but trusting. As they walked away from the platform, the storm raged on behind them. But ahead lay a road neither could yet see clearly, a road marked by faith, trials, and a promise kept in the snow. And unseen by both of them, heaven watched quietly, and smiled. The wagon waited just beyond the glow of the station lanterns, half buried in snow, its canvas tops snapping sharply in the wind. Zachary Foster brushed the seat clear with his gloved arm, then helped Amelia Kane climb up, careful not to rush her, careful not to assume too much. The moment she settled inside, the storm seemed louder. Zachary wrapped a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders before climbing in himself, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He took the reins, clicked softly to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward into the darkness. The station vanished almost immediately behind them. For several long moments neither spoke. The only sounds were the wind shrieking across the plains, the labored snort of the horses, and the steady crunch of hooves through deep snow. Amelia stared out into the white blur, her heart still racing, not from cold alone but from the magnitude of what she had done. She had trusted a letter. She had trusted God. Zachary glanced at her from beneath the brim of his hat. She looked smaller now, swallowed by the blanket and the storm, yet there was a quiet steadiness in her posture that stirred something in him. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry the weather's like this," he said. "I hoped your first sight of Texas would be kinder." Amelia smiled faintly, her breath fogging the air. "I prayed for courage," she replied. "I suppose the Lord decided to give me practice right away." That earned a low chuckle from Zachary, brief but genuine. "He does tend to do that." They rode on, the wagon swaying as it crossed uneven ground. The storm pressed in from every side, and Amelia's thoughts drifted back to the letter she had received months earlier. The careful handwriting, the honest tone, the scripture quoted at the bottom. "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain." She turned to him. "You wrote that verse because you believe it?" Zachary nodded, eyes never leaving the trail he could barely see. "Because I've lived the opposite. Tried building things on my own strength once. Didn't last." Amelia considered his words. "I left a comfortable life behind," she said quietly. "People said I was foolish." "Were they wrong?" he asked, not unkindly. She took a slow breath. "I don't know yet. But I know God asked me to trust him. And trust usually feels a lot like standing in a storm without knowing what's ahead." Zachary swallowed, something tightening in his chest. He had faced stampedes, droughts, and gunfire, but this woman's faith felt braver than all of it. The horses slowed as the wind worsened, forcing him to guide them carefully. Snow stung his face and his fingers burned despite the gloves. He shifted slightly, angling his body to block the worst of the wind from her. "I should tell you something," he said after a while. Amelia turned fully toward him, her expression open but attentive. "I'm not a rich man," Zachary continued. "There's land, enough to work. A cabin that's sturdy but plain. Some cattle. That's about it. I won't ever promise silk dresses or city comforts." Amelia didn't answer right away. She looked down at her Bible, fingers brushing the worn leather cover. "I didn't answer your advertisement because of what you had," she said at last. "I answered because you said you prayed before you sent it." Zachary's grip tightened on the reins. "Every night," he admitted. "Right up until tonight." The wagon crested a small rise, and for a brief moment the storm thinned, revealing the vast frozen plains stretching endlessly in every direction. Amelia's breath caught, not with fear this time but awe. "So this is where God is planting us," she murmured. Zachary nodded. "If you still wish to stay." She met his eyes, steady and sure. "I didn't travel this far to turn back at the first hardship." They shared a quiet moment then, no promises spoken, no vows exchanged, just a shared understanding that this journey was more than a marriage arrangement. It was obedience. The cold deepened as the hours stretched on. Amelia's hands trembled and Zachary noticed immediately. Without a word, he removed one glove and placed his bare hand over hers, rough and warm. "Just until we reach the cabin," he said. "It's not far now." Her fingers curled instinctively around his. "Thank you." The simple contact sent a jolt through both of them, unexpected, grounding. Zachary felt something settle in his spirit, like a piece finally finding its place. As they rode on, Amelia bowed her head slightly. "May I pray?" Zachary's voice softened. "Please." Her prayer was quiet but unwavering, carried on the wind. She prayed for safe passage, for strength, for wisdom. She prayed for Zachary by name, asking God to bless the work of his hands and guard his heart. Zachary listened, throat tight. No one had ever prayed for him like that before. When she finished, the storm seemed a little less fierce, not because it had weakened, but because they were no longer facing it alone. The wagon lights flickered in the distance ahead, the faint outline of home. And though neither of them could yet see what the future would demand, both knew one thing with certainty. This road, hard as it was, had been chosen by God. The wagon slowed as the faint glow ahead sharpened into the outline of a cabin, its single window lit from within like a lone star against the endless dark. Snow clung to the low roof, and the chimney sent a thin ribbon of smoke into the blizzard-torn sky. "There," Zachary Foster said quietly. "That's home." The word lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Amelia Kane leaned forward slightly, peering through the swirling snow. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined, rough-hewn logs stacked by patient hands, its edges softened by years of wind and weather. It did not look like safety. It looked like work. And yet, something in her chest warmed. Zachary brought the wagon to a stop and jumped down, boots sinking deep. He moved quickly despite the cold, tying off the reins and checking the horses before turning back to help Amelia descend. His hands were careful, steady as he lifted her to the ground. The wind howled around them, relentless. "Inside," he urged gently, "before the cold steals your breath." The door creaked open under his push, releasing a rush of warmth and the scent of wood smoke. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean, a single-room space with a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the wall, and a stone hearth where a fire crackled patiently. Amelia paused just inside the threshold. For a long moment she said nothing. Zachary's chest tightened. "I know it's not much," he said quickly. "I meant to finish the second room before spring." She set her valise down and sank slowly to her knees beside the hearth. Zachary froze. Amelia bowed her head, the firelight dancing across her face as she clasped her hands together. Her voice trembled, not from cold but from reverence. "Lord," she whispered, "thank you for bringing me safely. Thank you for this man who kept his word. Bless this home even before its walls are strong. Build it on your truth and let it be a place of peace." Tears burned behind Zachary's eyes. No one had ever prayed over his home. He removed his hat slowly and lowered his head, standing awkwardly as if unsure where to place his faith-worn hands. The cabin felt different suddenly, sanctified by simple trust. When Amelia rose, her eyes were bright but calm. "It's enough," she said softly. "More than enough." Relief rushed through Zachary so fast it left him lightheaded. "I'll fetch water," he said, needing movement to steady himself. As he stepped outside, the storm clawed at him again, but inside something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a place he had merely survived in. It felt like the beginning of something sacred. When he returned, Amelia had removed her coat and scarf, hanging them carefully by the door. She moved quietly, instinctively, as though listening for the spirit of the place. She had placed her Bible on the table, open, its pages fluttering slightly in the heat. "I hope it's all right," she said. "I thought we might read." Zachary nodded, voice thick. "I'd like that." They sat across from one another, the fire snapping between them. Amelia read aloud from Psalms, her voice steady and warm, filling the small space with words older than the land itself. "The Lord is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." Zachary closed his eyes as she read, the words sinking deep. He had believed those verses in theory. Tonight they felt tangible. When she finished, silence settled, not empty but full. "I should tell you," Zachary said after a moment, "I've lived alone a long time. I'm not always gentle with words." Amelia smiled kindly. "Then I'll listen carefully." That simple response undid him. They spoke late into the night, about her years as a schoolteacher, about the children she'd taught to read by candlelight, about his work with cattle, the rhythm of seasons, the loneliness of evenings with only the wind for company. Zachary confessed his fears. "I don't know if I'll be enough. I can work. I can provide. But leading a family in faith, that feels heavier than any load I've ever hauled." Amelia reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You don't have to carry it alone. God never asked one person to hold the weight by themselves." The fire burned low as exhaustion crept in. Zachary stood, clearing his throat. "You should rest. I'll sleep by the hearth." Amelia met his gaze, understanding the respect in his offer. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." Before retiring, she knelt once more beside the bed, praying quietly. Zachary watched from across the room, heart full and humbled. He had invited a woman into his life, but God had sent a partner. As the storm finally began to fade outside, Zachary lay awake by the fire, staring into the dying embers. For the first time in years he was not alone. And for the first time, his home felt like a house the Lord himself had begun to build. Spring arrived quietly, almost shyly, as if unsure whether the land would receive it. Snow melted into mud, and the plains exhaled after a long winter. Grass pushed through the soil in thin, hopeful strands, and the sky softened into pale blues that promised renewal. For a time hope seemed justified. Zachary Foster worked from dawn until the stars reappeared, repairing fences torn down by winter storms, mending tack and readying the fields for planting. Amelia Kane rose early as well, her days filled with scrubbing, cooking and stitching, turning the small cabin into a place of order and warmth. Each morning began with prayer, each evening ended with scripture by lamplight. They were not wealthy, but they were grateful. Then the rains did not come. At first they laughed it off. "The Lord's just teaching us patience," Amelia said as she poured water sparingly into the wash basin. But as days turned to weeks, the laughter faded. The ground cracked beneath the sun. Young shoots withered before they could root. Cattle grew restless, ribs showing through thinning hides. Zachary's shoulders sagged beneath a weight no amount of muscle could lift. One evening he returned to the cabin later than usual, boots coated in dust, hat pulled low. Amelia looked up from the table and saw the strain etched deep into his face. "The north pasture's gone," he said quietly. "Nothing left for them there." Amelia rose, placing a plate before him. "Eat first." He shook his head. "I don't deserve it." The word struck her harder than the drought. She reached for his hands, feeling the roughness, the tremor beneath. "Zachary, look at me." He did. "You are not failing because the rain hasn't come," she said firmly. "You are standing. And God honors that." He pulled his hands free, pacing the small room. "I prayed. We prayed. I did everything I know how to do. And still, nothing." His fist slammed against the table, rattling the plates. "I'm failing you." Amelia flinched, but she did not step back. Instead, she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. He stood rigid at first, then slowly broke, his shoulders shaking as frustration and fear poured out. "I promised you a life," he whispered hoarsely. "Not this." She held him tighter. "You promised honesty, faith, presence. Those matter more than full barns." That night, they knelt together on the cabin floor, hands clasped, tears falling freely. "Lord," Zachary prayed, voice cracking, "I don't understand what you're doing. But I know I can't do this without you." The weeks that followed tested that prayer. Supplies dwindled. Zachary sold 2 head of cattle just to buy seed and flour. Amelia learned to stretch meals, baking bread from the last of the grain and watering down stew so it would last another day. Yet every morning Amelia opened her Bible. And every night, Zachary joined her. One afternoon, Amelia collapsed onto a chair, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Zachary knelt beside her, fear gripping him. "We should have never asked you to come out here," he said. "You'd be safe back east." She smiled weakly. Safety isn't always obedience. Those words settled deep in his spirit. The drought lingered, but something else began to grow. Neighbors came asking for advice, for prayer, for help mending tools. Amelia began teaching children under the shade of a lone oak, using chalk and scrap wood. Zachary shared what little he had even when it didn't make sense. And then one evening clouds gathered on the horizon. They were dark and heavy, rolling and slow and deliberate. Amelia stepped outside, heart pounding. Rain fell, not in a torrent but steady, gentle, faithful. They stood in the doorway, soaked and laughing through tears as the earth drank deeply. The drought did not end overnight. Losses could not be undone. But hope returned. That night, as thunder rolled softly in the distance, Zachary took Amelia's hands. "I thought faith meant certainty," he said. "But now I see, it's choosing to trust when nothing looks certain." Amelia nodded. Faith isn't proven when things go well. It's revealed when they don't. They prayed again, this time in gratitude, not because everything was fixed, but because God had not left them. And though they could not yet see the harvest, they knew their marriage had already taken root, deep, resilient, and anchored in faith. Time moved differently on the frontier. It did not rush. It settled. Seasons folded into one another like well-worn pages in a Bible, each marked by prayer, labor, and small mercies that only became visible in hindsight. The drought loosened its grip, not all at once but enough. Grass returned in patches. The cattle steadied. And in the middle of one ordinary morning, as Amelia Kane stood at the wash basin watching the sun rise over the plains, she realized something extraordinary. Her hands were trembling, not from cold but from life. When she told Zachary Foster that evening, his first response was silence. Then he sank slowly into the chair by the hearth, his face buried in his hands. "Lord," he whispered, "you're trusting us with a soul." Amelia crossed the room and knelt before him, placing his hands gently on her belly. "We won't be perfect," she said softly. "But we will be faithful." That night they prayed longer than usual. The months that followed were marked by anticipation and humility. Amelia continued her work, though more carefully now, and Zachary became attentive in ways he had never needed to be before, checking the floorboards for loose nails, building a sturdier crib from leftover pine, and rising whenever Amelia stirred in the night. When the child came, it was under a sky streaked with dawn. The labor was long and painful, but Amelia never cried out in fear, only in prayer. Zachary stood helpless at first, then strong when she needed him most, his voice low and steady as he prayed scripture aloud. When the baby finally cried, Zachary wept. They named the child Samuel because Amelia said, "He is asked of the Lord." Life did not slow to admire their joy. Chores multiplied. Sleep vanished. But laughter filled the cabin in ways silence never had. Samuel grew strong, his laughter echoing across the fields as Zachary carried him on his shoulders, pointing out birds and cattle and the endless sky. In time, 2 more children followed, Clara, quiet and observant, and Joseph, loud and fearless. Each arrival brought its own exhaustion and wonder, its own stretching of hearts already stretched thin. Amelia taught them letters by lamplight, using the same patience she once gave her students back east. Zachary taught them to work, to respect the land, and to bow their heads before meals, even when the plates were light. Their home became a gathering place. Neighbors came not because the Fosters were wealthy, but because peace lived within their walls. Amelia taught children from nearby homesteads, her voice drifting through the open door as Zachary worked outside. Zachary offered counsel, prayer, and help without expectation of return. One evening, as the children slept in a tangle of quilts, Amelia leaned against Zachary on the porch. "Do you ever miss the life you imagined?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "No. I miss the man I was before God showed me this one." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. They had no piano, no fine china, no city comforts. But they had bedtime prayers, hands clasped in the dark, and faith passed down like an inheritance. And though the dust never truly left their boots, love rooted itself deeply, stronger than hardship, richer than gold. The sickness came quietly like a thief in the night. At first it was only a cough, soft, easy to dismiss. Amelia Kane noticed it as she tucked Samuel into bed, his small chest rising and falling too quickly beneath the quilt. By morning, his skin burned beneath her palm. "Zachary," she said, keeping her voice calm though her heart had already begun to race. "He's warm." Zachary Foster came at once, kneeling beside the bed, his large hand swallowing Samuel's. "We'll keep watch," he said. "It's just a fever." They had seen fevers before. But this one did not break. By nightfall the fever worsened. Samuel drifted in and out of restless sleep, his breath shallow, his small fingers curling and uncurling as if grasping for something unseen. Amelia never left his side. She cooled his brow with damp cloths, whispering scripture between prayers, begging God for mercy she believed he could give. Zachary stoked the fire again and again, his movements frantic but controlled. He rode through the night to fetch a doctor from the nearest town, but the storm returned, cruel and familiar, slowing him until dawn. By the time he returned, hope had grown thin. The doctor shook his head gently. "We'll pray," he said. "That's all left now." Amelia heard those words like a sentence. She climbed onto the bed beside Samuel, gathering him into her arms. "Lord," she whispered, tears soaking into his hair, "you gave him to us. Please, please let him stay." Zachary stood at the foot of the bed, hat pressed to his chest, his lips moving soundlessly. He had prayed for rain, for strength, for provision, but never like this. As dawn crept into the room, Samuel's breathing slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Amelia's cry tore through the cabin, raw and broken, collapsing into sobs that shook her entire body. Zachary dropped to his knees, his forehead pressed to the floor, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles bled. "I don't understand," he whispered into the dirt. "I don't understand." They buried Samuel beneath the oak tree where Amelia once taught lessons in the shade. Clara clutched Amelia's skirt, confused and frightened. Joseph cried without knowing why. The earth closed over a life far too small. Days blurred into one another. Amelia moved through them like a shadow, cooking, cleaning, teaching, yet hollowed out, her prayers now whispered more in desperation than faith. Zachary withdrew into silence. He worked until exhaustion overtook him as though labor might outrun grief. At night, he stared into the fire, replaying every moment, every choice. Had he waited too long for the doctor? Had he failed as a father? One night the weight became too much. I prayed, Zachary said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. We both did. And God still took him. Amelia looked at him, her eyes red and rimmed with sorrow. He didn't take him, she said softly. He received him. Zachary shook his head. That doesn't make it hurt less. No, she agreed. But it keeps me from hating God. They knelt together that night, not in strength but in surrender. Their prayers were broken, fragmented, more tears than words. And still God remained. Weeks passed. The pain dulled but did not disappear. Yet in quiet ways healing crept in. Clara began asking questions about heaven. Joseph laid flowers by the oak tree without being told. One evening, as the sun set in hues of gold and crimson, Zachary reached for Amelia's hand. I thought faith meant answers, he said. Now I know it means staying when there are none. Amelia leaned into him. We are still here, she whispered. That must count for something. And it did. Their faith had cracked, but it did not shatter. Their love bent, but it did not break. In the valley of loss they discovered something holy. God had never left them. And even in sorrow he was still building their story. Time softened the sharpest edges of grief, though it never erased them. Years passed, measured not by calendars but by the slow turning of seasons and the growing height marks etched into the cabin wall. The oak tree where Samuel rested stood tall now, its branches wide and sheltering, its roots deep in the same soil that had known drought, storm, and sorrow. Zachary Foster moved more slowly these days. Silver threaded through his dark beard, and his hands bore scars not just from work, but from years of holding on when letting go would have been easier. Amelia Kane walked with a gentler pace as well, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes deepened by joy and sorrow shared in equal measure. They had not escaped hardship. They had endured it. The ranch had grown, not into wealth but into sufficiency. The land responded now to patient stewardship. Fences stood straight. Cattle grazed contentedly. Neighbors came often, seeking not just trade but counsel. Amelia's school had become a fixture of the valley. Children gathered beneath the oak in fair weather and in the cabin during rain, their voices filling the air with recitations and laughter. She taught reading, arithmetic, and scripture with equal care, believing each child carried a purpose known first by God. Zachary led prayers at gatherings, his voice roughened by years of wind and honesty. He was not eloquent but he was sincere, and that sincerity drew people in. One afternoon, as Zachary watched Joseph mend a fence and Clara read to younger children, he turned to Amelia. We didn't plan any of this, he said quietly. She smiled. God rarely asks permission before he blesses. They laughed softly. Evenings became sacred rituals. Supper, stories, prayer. The past was never ignored but it was no longer feared. Samuel's name was spoken freely, his life honored without bitterness. One autumn the harvest was especially good. Grain filled the bins. Smoke rose from chimneys across the valley. The land seemed to exhale in gratitude. Neighbors gathered at the Foster home for a celebration. There was music, shared bread, and testimonies of God's faithfulness. Zachary stood, hat in hand, and spoke simply. I once thought success was owning land, he said. Turns out it's standing together when everything else shakes. Amelia's eyes shone as she watched him. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the fire burned low, they sat side by side on the porch. Do you remember the blizzard? Amelia asked. Zachary nodded. I remember thinking I might freeze before the train arrived. She smiled. And yet, you waited. He took her hand, his grip still strong. I didn't know what kind of life we'd build. Only that I didn't want to miss it. The wind rustled through the fields, carrying with it the sound of children's laughter drifting from nearby homes. Families they had touched, lives they had shaped. Their harvest was not counted in bushels alone. It was counted in faith passed down, in love practiced daily, and in a testimony forged through obedience. And as the stars emerged one by one, Zachary and Amelia sat in quiet gratitude, content in the knowledge that the life they had built together was rich beyond measure. Winter returned softly in their later years, not with the violence of the blizzard that had once marked their beginning, but with a quiet dignity that suited the season of their lives. Snow fell in patient drifts, blanketing the land as though heaven itself wished to hush the world. Inside the cabin, now expanded, weathered, and warm, Zachary Foster sat in his chair by the hearth, a quilt over his legs, the fire casting gentle light across the familiar room. His hands, once so strong and restless, rested now in Amelia Kane's, still rough from work but steady with peace. Outside, the wind whispered instead of roared. It sounds like that first night, Zachary murmured, eyes half closed. The blizzard. Amelia smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. You were standing alone on a platform, freezing. I was terrified, he admitted. I kept wondering if the train would ever come. Or if you would. She squeezed his hand. And I was stepping into the dark, praying someone would be there. The fire popped softly. For a moment they sat in silence, the kind that only decades of shared life can create, full, unhurried, and safe. You know, Zachary said after a while, I thought riches meant land, cattle, leaving something behind. Amelia looked up at him. And now? He glanced around the room, the walls lined with photographs, the marks on the doorframe where children once grew, the Bible worn thin from years of faithful reading. Now I know it's this, he said. Companionship. Shared purpose. Knowing I never walked alone. Amelia's eyes glistened. God was kind to us. Yes, he said softly. Even when we didn't understand it. Their children were grown now, scattered across the land, carrying with them the faith and values planted in this small home. Grandchildren visited when the roads allowed, filling the cabin with laughter that echoed memories long past. Later that evening, Amelia rose slowly and retrieved the Bible from the table. May I? She asked. Zachary nodded. Always. She read from Ecclesiastes, her voice steady and warm. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up the other. Zachary closed his eyes, the words settling like a benediction. Thank you for waiting for me, Amelia whispered when she finished. He opened his eyes and smiled. Thank you for stepping off that train. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering every track, every scar the land had ever known. The past lay quiet beneath its grace. As the fire burned low, Zachary's breathing slowed. Amelia remained beside him, her hand never leaving his. When dawn came, it found peace in that cabin. And though life beyond continued, unchanged and unknowing, the story of Zachary Foster and Amelia Kane stood complete, a testimony not of ease but of endurance, not of wealth but of faith. The true riches of their lives were not what they owned, but who they loved, what they built together, and the God who never missed them, not once. Amen.